Bueno, pues buenos días a todas.
Good morning, everyone.
As Camus said, as we heard yesterday, that a theatre stage is one of the places in the world where he was happy. And I'd like to say that this stage here in the polyvalent theatre Albert Camus is one of the places in the world where the team of the Trobades and Premis Mediterrànies Albert Camus are happy. So welcome you all to the 4th edition of the Trobades Mediterrànies Albert Camus. As you all know, for those who have already attended the previous editions, we started in 2017 in order to celebrate the anniversary of the Nobel Prize bestowed to Albert Camus. And we decided that we wanted the thinking of Albert Camus to mark our path and follow its compass. And as Miguel said earlier, the myths are there waiting for us to embody them. And these mythical figures have been placed as a symbol for each of these editions, not to get away from the world, but to come closer to it. We had in 2017 Ithaca. In 2019 we were focused on Prometheus, and in 2021 it was Nemesis, the goddess of solidarity. And to understand that the only path to go forth is dialogue. And this year we are going to follow the symbol of Sisyphus, that is holding onto his rock, facing the future of knowing that he's going to need to reface it once and again. A Sisyphus that goes up the slope once and again, a Sisyphus resisting. And this is why today this edition has as a title Places in the World. This first day is the Places of Resistance, the name of this first day of the edition. And we are going to try and prevent the world from falling apart. And Agnès Spiquel has been chosen for this, to deal with this topic, and I'd like to thank Agnès Spiquel for her work in collaborating in the design of this edition of the Trobades. So once we will have these elements that Agnès will offer us, so that we can be aware of the reality and that we can obtain some critical elements and be able to explore our frailties, always escaping from the culture of consumption, of the culture of the spectacles. Frank Planel, Mani Bebin, Natalia Menendez will be in charge of talking about this. And then Abderrahman Sissako is invited to talk about to live is not to resign oneself. We're talking about culture, escape culture. And particularly to protect thinking of freedom. Antonio Muñoz Molina and Laura Fernandez will talk about that. And then we must learn to be citizens that are subjects. The goal of the art, the goal of a life, is to increase the degree of freedom and responsibility that each man has and the world has, as Camus said, and this is something that Galbo, Belén Copegui and Pascal Obolo do, each of them in their own spheres. And today's gathering will finish today under this title, Truth Must Be Cultivated Like Love, Like Intelligence. Nothing must be taken for granted, and nothing is promised, but nothing is impossible for those who accept to take risks. And this is something we must remember when we are drowned by lies. This is the only way of opening doors up as Camus said. And who will open? The people who will open those doors for us will be Agnès Spiquel and Karima Ashadu. Gates that will be open for us so that we can tissue new places to create new imaginaries. And in this edition, while we're not using that phrase by Camus, places in the world, to find ourselves a physical place in the world, but to help us start seeing the places that allow us to go against and review history as it has been told to us, to restitute the place of women in other cultures, so that we can also find places where we can join what is scattered and explore places such as the theatre, art, the invention of ideas. And Anne Pluto and Alexis Lager will discuss this topic, as well as Urilla Bentuhami, to talk about repairing, and who would be the best person to talk about the theatre. Figures from the theatre, for example, Marta Pazos, Mohamed Aladar, and Dries Skizges. All these views of the places of the world have been convened to be and join us here in Saint-Gilles, in this place of the origins. Through dialogue, we will try to make you feel the vibration of our engagement and commitment of all the previous editions, and also this one this year, so that we are here to do everything possible. Welcome to the Trobades.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the introduction. Thank you very much, Sandra, for so this friend that recently left us. He died, so preventing from this world from falling apart. So that his slogans for today, this year's edition. It is often said that Camus dedicated his speeches in Sweden to his teacher when he published them. So that was in December 1957. So he dedicated the honor, the Nobel Prize for Literature, to his entire generation. Which in fact, when he refers to his generation, he says, and I quote, he deserves to be saluted and encouraged because its task is immense. Each generation, he says, no doubt believes it's destined to remake the world, yet my generation knows that it will not remake it, but its task is perhaps greater. It is to prevent the world from falling apart. My task today, this morning, is to make these words resonate in all their breadth. This generation, born in the 1910s, came of age at the time of the rise of fascism and the Spanish War. So they experienced the Second World War, of course, saw the establishment of the concentration camp universe, and witnessed the destructive power of the atomic bomb. Obviously, the situation is not exactly the same today, 60 years later, but Camus's words defining the legacy of his generation are strangely and oddly relevant to us today. Heir to a corrupt history where fallen revolutions, techniques gone mad, dead words, and exhausted ideologies are mixed together, where mediocre powers can now destroy everything but no longer know how to convince, where intelligence has stooped to the point of becoming the servant of hatred, of oppression, this generation has had to restore in itself and around it, from its own negations, a little of what makes the dignity of living and dying. End of quote. So in 1957, he made this bitter and at the same time hopeful observation. For this generation has already begun its task, the task he refers to. So, since the post-war period, Camus has taken a clear-sighted look at France, at Europe and the rest of the world, using all the means at his disposal, including journalism, to denounce the forces of disintegration and death at work. But at the same time, he affirms and settles values in the name of which we can draw perspectives, open up paths. And he does so as an artist at the Uppsala conference, which follows the Stockholm speech by a few days, just a few days, is entitled The Artist and His Time. In this journey through Camus, I'm proposing at each step you will easily hear the echoes with today's world. They match quite well. In 2023, as in 1957, it's a question of forging, I quote, forging an art of living in times of catastrophe. Preventing the world from falling apart is first and foremost about living to the full. So this observation that the world is falling apart is nothing new to Camus. He was born in 1913, orphan of a father, killed just at the beginning of the First World War. He grew up in Algeria, where the happiness of life didn't mask the iniquity of the colonial system in which France was in the process of denying its own values. During the Second World War, he joined the resistance through the Combat network, thus becoming one of the pillars of the newspaper of the same name. At the liberation, he appeared as one of the spokespeople of the resistance through his writing as a journalist and then through the publication of his novel The Plague, which was received as an allegory of the resistance. His texts in the immediate post-war period are permeated by the themes that would be developed 10 years later in his Stockholm speech. In addition to the numerous editorials he wrote for the newspaper Combat, two texts are particularly noteworthy. I'm going to quote them. A conference he gave in the United States in 1946 under the title La crise de l'homme, the crisis of man, and a series of 8 articles he published in Combat in 1946 under the title Ni victime ni bourreau, neither victims nor executors. So I will revolve around these two texts, where what Camus is clearly pointing out is the fact that the death instinct is at work in history, especially in Western civilization. Already with his letters to a German friend, written during the war and published in 1945, he showed Nazism and the fruit of this death instinct that had become dominant. In the following texts, he shows how this instinct ushered a century of fear, I quote, the causes and implications of which he investigates. He denounced a destructive rage never known in the history of mankind, a science used for organized murder by states that sow terror to establish their domination. On August the 8th, 1945, when Western countries massively approved the decision of the United States to drop the bomb on Hiroshima, Camus, on the contrary, condemned it as state terrorism. And I quote his editorial. We shall summarize in one sentence. Mechanical civilization has reached its last degree of savagery. It will be necessary to choose in the more or less near future between collective suicide and the intelligent use of scientific conquests. End of quote. According to Camus, the Cold War that is taking place in the post-war period is no less deadly in the long run than the other, since it's based on the balance of military forces in both parties. It's the whole of industrial development, and Camus didn't experience the meteoric development of world finance that carries the seeds of death, because in the name of progress and by aiming for efficiency, one takes sides with murder, considering that ultimately the end justifies the means. If the world is falling apart, it is also because human beings are disappearing behind abstractions, we would say today behind figures, acronyms, and tables. And the evolution of these abstractions is regulated in the mode of an obvious necessity. We invoke the sense of history, or more prosaically, we repeat, there is no other solution. Only perceived in its historical, political, and social dimension, the human being or human beings are no longer considered as such. We are alone in the face of an inhuman system, of which we feel like a powerless toy. We are humiliated, judged, condemned, both individually and collectively. So, how can we situate ourselves in order to act freely? So, Camus says, neither victims nor executioners. If we remain silent, we'll take the side of executioners, we'll legitimize murder, we resign ourselves to massacre. But we cannot resign ourselves, even if it's an active fraternity with the victims. Neither victims nor executioners. We need to reconsider one's thinking and one's actions. Indeed, values have been perverted. Socialism, revolution, democracy, collectivization of sources, truth of facts. All this is devoid of all content. Any contract seems unattainable. The future no longer seems possible. I summarize here Camus's thinking in the 1946 series of articles. The European and North American powers are leading to moral failure through this shrinking of the human being and this perversion of values, which they are constantly carrying out in a relentless way, with the destructive illusion of making them prevail through military and economic power. One thinks of the current resentment. So, instead of leading us to a return or to foundational values of the West, promotes a much more international image of despotism and populism. In the 1946 text L'Exil de l'Aisne, Camus analyzes this failure in terms of forgetting or neglecting Greek heritage, in which he emphasizes beauty and measure. He says, we have exiled beauty, and sons of excess were embarked on the quest for totality, and in doing so, we have deorbited the universe. And I quote again, and this image seems to me extraordinary. We are living in ugliness and convulsion. Having become nihilistic, European civilization is heading towards a generalized suicide, Camus adds in a conference in Athens, 1955. Yet in this winter of the world, he recalls the strength of the almond trees that flower in or blossom in February in his country. In the beautiful text Les Amandiers, he pleads against despair in the face of the force of weapons that seems to have won and prevailed in the world against the forces of the spirit. And I quote him, when I lived in Algiers, I always waited in the winter, because I knew that in one cold and pure night in February, the almond trees of the Consul's Valley would be covered with white blossom. I marveled at the fact that this fragile snow would then resist all the rains and the winds from the sea. Every year, however, it persisted, just long enough to prepare for the fruit. End of quote. Camus draws on this image, the image of almond trees, and also on the virtues of the spirit advocated by Nietzsche, to assert strongly that in the face of arms, one can still and always oppose the force of the spirit, which without weight resists all the winds from the sea by the virtue of whitenesses and sand. Camus doesn't deny the tragic, but he refuses despair, and in the same text, Les Amandiers, he draws paths for the future. I quote these magnificent sentences. I won't elaborate on them because we will do so with other speakers. Our task as men is to find the few formulas that will soothe the infinite anguish of free souls. We have to sew up what has been torn, to make imaginable justice in a world so obviously unjust, meaningful happiness for peoples poisoned by the misfortune of this century. Naturally, this is a superhuman task, but tasks that take men a long time to accomplish are called superhuman, that is all. How then can these tasks be accomplished? First of all, this is not a question of remaking the world. Camus has nothing but distrust for ideologies that promise everything for tomorrow. He refuses to justify them by the idea of progress, such as the Enlightenment had introduced. He wants and right. He says neither victims nor executors. We have to define the conditions of a modest political thought, delivered from or devoid of all messianism and devoid of nostalgia and earthly paradise. End of quote. So this new utopia will consist of wanting to save the bodies and work strongly in favor of peace and the international conditions for it to prevail. I'm thinking of Miguel Angel's words. That's why I lost the thread of my presentation. So it is about a future that our previous generations were not prepared for, and the coming generation will have to be. So this urges us today. So how are we encouraged today, the present generations? Are we prepared to wage that war? So this implies the whole world to transform words and thoughts. In his conference about the crisis of man, we need to call things by their name. One doesn't think badly because one is a murderer. One is a murderer because one thinks badly. That is how you can be a murderer without even having killed, apparently. The first thing to do is therefore the pure and simple rejection through thought and action of all forms of realistic and fatalistic thinking. This is the work of every one of us. In condemning all forms of realistic and fatalistic thinking, Camus doesn't preach against lucidity. Both adjectives are mutually explanatory. The protester is often advised to be realistic, to resign himself. But Camus refuses this outright. Camus believes in the power of the mind and the words. And I quote him again. From now on, the only honor will be to obstinately hold this formidably challenge, which will finally decide whether words are stronger than bullets. End of quote. To orientate this struggle, Camus doesn't seek meaning, but proposes values. In the first cycle of his work, focused on the notion of the absurd, he showed how one can live when one has accepted the fact that nothing has any meaning, nothing makes sense, when one has confronted this tragic condition of human beings instead of seeking philosophical or religious answers. He had shown this through characters such as Meso, Sisyphus, or Caligula, solitary characters confronting with more misfortune and death. Obviously, Caligula remains locked up in his pain. unlike Sisyphus and Meursault, who each in his own way know how to open up to the world. Both have the lucidity. Sisyphus knows that the gods condemned him forever to this absurd punishment. Meursault has known for a long time that nothing matters, that death takes everything away in advance. Both have courage, are courageous. Meursault comes out of himself to shout that to the prison chaplain this paradoxical truth: the chaplain is not in life, while he, the condemned man, lives to the full and would be ready to live it all over again. Sisyphus refuses any recrimination against gods he denies. He simply accomplishes his task, however absurd it may be, but knowing that the struggle towards the highs is enough to fill a man's heart. Camus shows Sisyphus and Meursault with full hearts. Meursault, open to the memory of his mother and open to the world, and can say, I felt that I was happy and I am still happy. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, he says. The values that can sustain this struggle against the forces of this disintegration of death at work, and that can accompany all those forces, which Camus develops in his cycle of revolt in his novel The Plague and his play The State of Siege. He showed characters fighting together against evil that befalls mankind, whether in the form of a virus or a dictator. They fight in the name of brotherhood, because they share the same fate. The chronicler at the plague can only be one of the Oranese locked up in this plague-ridden city. Diego, on his part, is stricken with the same mysterious evil as the other opponents of the dictator. In their bitter and dangerous struggle, they seem to lose all feeling at times. But this doesn't prevent their children or beloved women from dying. Both heroes grasp the importance of friendship, of love and tenderness. In L'État de Siege, Diego chooses to die so that Victoria may live because, and I quote, "This world needs you. It needs our women to learn to live. We men have never been capable of anything but death." In The Plague, Dr. Rieu, who has fought the epidemic with all his might, finally understands what is essential. It is not whether these things make sense or not. It is to see what is answered to the hope of men, what answer we can give. And what is replied is that if there is one thing we can always desire and sometimes obtain, it is human tenderness. Camus himself led this struggle against the forces of death because, as a journalist and as an embarked intellectually, he rejects the term engage, he could make his work resonate in France and beyond, given to the notoriety he acquired in the second half of the 1940s. Even if his speeches, articles and essays provoked controversy, he made his voice heard, a word, as I say, that provided many ethical values. He didn't set himself up as the wise man, nor as a preacher of morals. He awakens consciences. He recalls the impetus of the resistance. He speaks for human beings. He's not the only one. In France, and even more so in the whole of Europe, he's in dialogue with people of goodwill, intellectuals who fight in the name of the same values as him, often in the face of failure and solitude, and one of the only ones in France to do so against Stalinism at that time. From this dialogue, current researchers are bringing to light fascinating traces which outline this European intellectual climate, aiming, in the words of Camus, to take things back to their beginning in order to remake a living society within a condemned society. End of quote. We are facing the same situation, more or less. So he said in Stockholm, we can salute what his generation has already done to begin to accomplish this task. So I feel that all parts of the world, they are facing this double challenge of truth and freedom without hatred. I will not dwell on this statement, that we will tackle this tomorrow, and when he says in the same sentence, he speaks about the struggle for peace and reconciliation of work and culture. I will only quote the beautiful image he uses to make an ark of the covenant with all men. He brings back into the human sphere to the biblical image of God's covenant with his people. He lets the image of the rainbow emerge to suggest a universal federation. The artist, like every other human being, works on this collective task. Camus does so with his own means. So he works and does with his own means. A fact that is strongly underlined in his two speeches in Sweden, in his Nobel Prize speech, and the lecture The Artist and His Time. So, this responsibility of an artist is an honor, which implies an obligation of solidarity. And what he shares with others is the world as it is today, and the painful human condition. So, unhappiness and hope of mankind will resound, but their very creation requires solitude. The artist cannot create in noise, amid noise and entertainment. Beauty, that which one receives as much as that which one tries to create, requires a bitter face-to-face. Camus meditates at length on the irremediable solitude of true artists, and he evokes Nietzsche. For him, he's a poet and a philosopher. He says he entered into a definitive solitude, crushed and exalted at the same time by the prospect of this immense work that he had to accomplish without any help. Here we find the dilemma on which the short story Jonah, or The Artist at Work, in the Exiled and the Kingdom ended. After a period of sterility, but before that we think about the symbolic importance of death. And there is a word we could decipher. We could speak about solitary or solidarity. The tension is not between a negative and a negative pole. Rather, the artist has the imperative need for solitude, and he is aloof from others. In the 1950s, Camus experienced this tension, in the form of personal exhaustion. He also goes through serious moments of doubt, both about his own talent as a creator and about the risks of imposture. He says he questions whether that is legitimate. Can creating with words prevent the world from falling apart? Since the 1930s, he has never ceased to reflect along or in dialogue with artists and philosophers about power. This meditation leads to the shocking formula found in the introduction to The Rebel. Parler répare. If in the context it is a question of man's confrontation with the absurd, the expression, supported by its sound construction, that speaking repairs, acquires a greater significance in these years of crisis. Moreover, he responds to himself when he writes in those prose poems about the posterity of the sun. He says, speaking also separates. However, it is not a matter of remaining silent, but of speaking differently, of speaking from elsewhere. This is best understood if we read the posterity of the sun. There, and I quote, he says, the day ends, leaves crunch. They will wait again. You like them better from here. Talking separates too. End of quote. Camus speaks this about the posterity of the sun. Speech is not communication when it is ill-fitting. It happens from afar. And we can envision a deeper communication. In the early 1950s, Camus asked himself about this specific question about speech that the writer-artist could choose in order to prevent the world from falling apart, since the word he had spoken publicly and his work developed along this philosophical path he had assigned to it before the world, this cycle of the absurd and then that of revolt. So he asks, how can establish this here from where he can love and speak better? Obviously, theater occupies plays an important role here. I'm going to quote him when he speaks about another place from where we can talk to the world from the world. I recall that in the years preceding his accidental death, Camus was working to have a Parisian theater entrusted to him where he could freely develop his project. That was to be done in the 1960s. The place from which he must and wants to speak is what is not yet called the Algerian war. In a moment in which the world is falling apart in the worst possible way. Camus spoke first in the old mode, through the press, speeches, essays, or in the appeal for a civil truce in Algeria. He speaks in January 1956 of the initiative of liberal friends from both communities, but it was a failure, so he then gathered together all the texts he had written on Algeria. So they were published in June 1958 under Chronique Algérienne, but this collection of 20 years of texts became the assessment of a double failure, that of France in Algeria and his own failure. He needs to tackle Algeria differently, just to reinvent this community, to invent the community of the future, to affirm that this is a possibility and it is also desirable. He says, I want to believe with all my strength that peace will rise on our fields, on our mountains, on our shores and paths, so that ultimately Arabs and French reconcile in freedom and justice. And this will make the effort to forget and neglect the blood that separates them today. To speak of Algeria is to show it in a different way, in a different light, through the means of art, through his stories. In fact, through space-time and characters, it enters concretely into these short stories of L'Exil, Le Royaume, and The First Man. He shows that Algeria was a main focus. So in this unfinished novel, he shows us that the Algerian question would have been central to it. So, but the novel goes further. If the artist aims at preventing the world from falling apart, art must bring people together by making silence resound. It needs to move the greatest number of men by offering them a privileged image of common sufferings and joys. It is because he understood that Camus has already initiated. And he also wrote from love. Love changes everything. He speaks about those he loves, but he is going to write in a different way, by allowing emotion to simmer more. In fact, he doesn't want to write an autobiography, but through these few anonymous members of his family, he wants to show a human being crushed by history. This is the case of the mother of the main character, who has just learned from the death of her husband, killed in 1914 at Verdun. And I quote, she remains mute and tearless for long hours, clutching in her pocket this letter she couldn't read.
Camus also wanted to bear witness to the eminent dignity of these poor people. He also wants again and again, but more concretely than in the essays and articles, to fight to preserve the part of man that does not belong to history, the part where one can be fully human. And to conclude, preventing the world from falling apart means fighting for truth and freedom, as will be said at length during these 2 days. But it also means giving life and joy a chance, discovering a light within oneself and preserving its sources, as he says so magnificently in Back to Tipasa. I rediscovered in Tipasa that it was necessary to keep within oneself a freshness, a source of joy, to love the day that escapes injustice, and to return to the battle with this conquered light. Here I found the old beauty, a young sky, and I measured my luck, understanding at last that in the worst years of our madness, the memory of this sky had never left me. It was this sky which, in the end, had prevented me from despairing. In the middle of winter, I learned at last that there was an invincible summer in me. The world today is falling apart, is unravelling, and even more so with the climate catastrophe, climate disaster. The task of the generations to come is increasingly heavy. It is up to us to give them the energy. Camus, help us do this. Thank you.